Paul Dulaney has been in the advanced analytics and data science for 17 years. He joined CA Technologies in 2013 and has led the development of the analytic modeling infrastructure and the first model produced in the CA data services team, and now is leading the data science team for CA. Prior to joining CA Technologies, he was in the SAS Institute for over 8 years, where he was on the team that developed the first fraud models for the SAS Enterprise Fraud Management Solutions. But as I was chatting with him earlier, he also said that in his previous life, he was developing fraud models for checks. Now, we all know that in the United States, checks are still around, but in South Africa, just for Paul's information, is that pretty much checks are a dying breed here. And in a show of hands in the room, who wrote out a check last? No one. In the last 10 years, 15 years, 10 years, we've got one there, two there. So Paul, talking about card and moving on to fraud and card is very topical in this industry. So we look forward to hearing your discussion. And that leads us on to the topic that Paul's going to be talking about, which is 3D Secure, the good, bad, the ugly, and the not so ugly. So I'd like to hand over to Paul. We might be a bit tight for time, but Paul has indicated that if there's no time for questions afterwards, he is around all day. So make a note of those questions. If we have time afterwards, we'll certainly take them here in the room so everybody can hear them. But if not, Paul certainly will be here. Make a note of your questions. He would love to hear from
inside that mag stripe, CVV2 on the outside. We've now gone to chip, all to have better authentication by that card being present. And so because of that, as issuers, we accepted the liability for fraud that happened on that. But for the card not present, early on it was Moto, a catalog shopping, something like that. Not very prevalent, and because the card was not present, we could not authenticate it, so we asked the merchant to take the liability for fraud there. The world has changed. We have e-commerce. We have a flood of transactions that are really happening online without that card, and so we needed to do something different. So 3D Secure looks at those card not present transactions and does authentication for them. Classically, that was challenged with a password or do a one-time password or something, and we'll talk about some other alternatives that have developed over time. Generally, it also involves a liability shift. They assume that you're at the same place as the merchant. Well, here we know we're not. There's a lot of information about the device that's not there. So with this, we can gather that information. We know where the device is. And that device is following around with the person making the transaction. It's not the merchant who owns it, it's the cardholder or the fraudster. And that can lead to very interesting things in the data. The bad part about it is initially we do a 100% challenge. So what does that mean? That means if that cardholder doesn't feel like doing that challenge, if they feel surprised by it, if they don't have their mobile phone near for the SMS, if the SMS doesn't come through, they get frustrated and they leave. That means we've lost revenue as issuers and we've lost revenue as merchants. So that's a very bad customer experience. That is the true bad part of it. And in terms of the ugly, the not so ugly, there are going to be changes to these rails to make it better. And even right now, we as issuers can do a lot to make it better. Better for our cardholders, better for the merchants, and better for ourselves. So with that, there's an authentication response, which then can be sent along with the authorization message in order to authorize this transaction. So that's the basic idea of what 3D Secure does. One thing that's very nice is with that device moving around, with the various different information we have, we can look at other things for fraud trends. We don't have to just look at the merchant location. We certainly can look at the merchant location. We can look at the velocity of funds and all on the card. We can also look at the velocity of funds on the device, because the device is now something separate from that merchant. So looking at some of the fraud trends, e-commerce is really global. Back when it was card present, and I'm a fraudster, I need to do my fraud in my local area. With e-commerce, I can be sitting in the Ukraine, and I can do fraud around the world. Or I can be sitting in LA and do fraud around the world. It doesn't matter where I am. And so we see these same rings getting the information online and then spreading out around the world, attacking all the different issuers. So some of the fraud episodes that I've seen looking through our data can involve 4 different issuers on 3 different continents. That's pretty huge. So we can share that information. We can look at fraud at a global level and see what those patterns are. And in fact, if we can do that in real time, following what the device is doing, following what's happening with the card, that can really get us a wonderful picture and enable us to stop the fraudsters in real time. So the colors don't come out very well here, but this is looking at essentially transactions where the device is not in the issuing country. So you're often thinking about an international transaction being where the merchant is elsewhere. But we now have the device, and we can ask, when is that device in another country? So for South Africa, is that device in the United States? Is it over in Australia? Is it in India? So one of the key things is there's significant differences in fraud rates throughout the world. There are some interesting areas that are kind of hotspots where people are doing fraud there on issuing from other countries. And the key thing that we need to do is make sure that when we're using a score or we're using rules, we capture that information. So that's an essential thing to make sure, do your rules, do your model reflect that, what's happening. And so here we're looking at what areas of the world are scoring high. Now I'm showing this at the level of country because that's the easiest one to see in a room like this. We know where that device is, based to be on the latitude and longitude, certainly to within the city, if not to within a town within a city. The thing is, if you just pay attention to this, you're going to lose something. Fraud in the 3D Secure world, in the e-commerce world, it's not static. It's not that one country is always going to be giving you fraud. So if we take a look at the variations in fraud, we're looking here at about a year and a quarter. And we're looking at it in 2-week increments. Where is the fraud happening? Again, foreign device. The fraud in a given country is on a device that's there, but the card issued elsewhere. And you can see there are a few places where they're pretty steadily red. But there's a lot of variation happening week to week, fortnight to fortnight. So that's an important thing to make sure that we don't just have a static table telling us, oh, this country's risky, that country's not. We have to look at the behaviors behind it to decide what is risky. when we're writing rules, when we're using a model, we have to look at these things and make sure that we're truly following the behavior patterns that indicate fraud. Does that make sense to everybody? So one of the things that I like to do is then look at a model, do the same thing. Now it's a slightly different scale here. Instead of being basis points of fraud, it's looking at what's scoring high, which means likely to be fraud, what's scoring low, likely not to be fraud. You see many of the same things happening here. In fact, if you get good rules, if you get a good model, it's going to track what is happening by the behaviors. So that's a key thing for us to look for. Another thing that's interesting is we can also find out the type of device. So when you look over the last 3 years, we've seen a nice trend. We see that this dark blue line is Windows, the Windows operating system. And so that's when someone has a laptop, they're coming on in, and we see that going down steadily. We also see the laptops on the Macintosh holding pretty much even, right? But what's interesting is the iOS mobile devices and the Android mobile devices. Now this is looking at the world as a whole. Certainly when you go to one region or another, you're going to see Android and iOS flip, right? There are cultural reasons why people prefer one or the other. Sometimes it just has to do with the price point within that market. But the key thing is they're both going up. More and more transactions are happening on those mobile devices. Now, currently, for 3D Secure 1.0, those have to happen in a browser, whether the app uses a browser embedded with it, or whether you're actually using the browser on your phone. As we go more and more to apps and making transactions in the apps, we need to make sure that we can deal with that in 3D Secure or in whatever fraud system we're using for these card-not-present transactions. There's one other line down here at the very bottom. That's the other. That's the poor people who still have a BlackBerry, or it's the fraudsters using Linux. You know, they love to use something like Linux where they can really dig into it. Another thing that's interesting, instead of just going at the cross-border transactions, as I mentioned earlier, you can ask, is the device and the merchant cross-border? Sorry. Or are they both domestic? Or is one cross-border versus the other? So when we look at all transactions, we see around the world, 84% have the device domestic and the merchant domestic. The next slice is that 11% where people are using their device within the issuing country but going to a merchant outside of it. Now here in South Africa, I think that slice of the pie is actually a bit bigger. There is a real tendency for people here to buy things from other countries as well. Then we can look at the very small slice of where you've got a cross-border device and a cross-border merchant. And then, again, another relatively small one where the device is cross-border and the merchant is domestic. The question is, what happens then when you go to look at fraud? This is then looking at fraud transactions. We see a dramatic reduction in those that are happening within country, right? Makes some sense. There's still a fair amount of fraud from within country. It's still the biggest slice of the pie, but it's gone from 84% down to 39%. What's interesting is that 1% where everything was cross-border has grown dramatically, right? We're now at 31% there. Also of interest, though, is which matters more, whether the device is cross-border or the merchant is cross-border. So you'll see that where we have a cross-border device and a domestic merchant, it hasn't changed much from the overall population. Why is that? Well, I'm here visiting South Africa, and I realized my son's birthday is in a week. I need to get something for him, and I can't wait till I'm back in the US. So I jump online, order something, and it'll be waiting at home for when I get home. That kind of thing is more prevalent than someone who's sitting in their issuing country and wants something from a merchant outside of their country. So it's interesting to see those different patterns. Now again, that is dependent upon what country you're in. Each country needs to look at its own patterns, but these are some of the global patterns. Now I want to get a bit geeky, and I apologize for that, but I'd like to take a look at an episode of fraud where my model was scoring high, right? So we always monitor in production what's happening. Do we have bouts where suddenly there are high scores and it looks like either there's something wrong with the model, there's something wrong with the data, or the fraudsters are doing a hit? And so we often will investigate those and try to figure out what's happening. So here's one where I've plotted the time along this axis, and then I just gave each card a number. There were 101 cards involved in this, so I just called them card 1 through 101. And then I plotted red squares for each one that was eventually reported as fraud, and then a black spot for each one that was not reported as fraud but was still on one of those cards. When you look at it this way, you don't see very much, right? You see a cluster in time, but it's not happening on a whole bunch of different cards. How am I going to separate this from someone having a great sale online, right? So I thought, let me take a look at the devices. So here, I instead numbered the devices, and there were 120 different device IDs available here, right? So you look at those devices, you see what's connected, and I put a blue line between those that are on the same device. Again, there's not much here I can sink my teeth in to truly understand that fraud. So in order to figure out, is this really something the model is picking up, should be picking up, we need to have rules for it, I decided to look at it in 3 dimensions. Suddenly you begin to see that while there aren't a lot of devices that go over a ton of cards, or cards that go over a bunch of devices, they're all interconnected. The green dotted lines are when it's the same card, and the blue lines are when it's the same device. And you get this cluster of transactions that are all interlinked. This is one of those ones that went across 3 different continents. And so a number of different issuers were involved here. And you would see the fraudsters hitting one, moving off to another, hitting that one, moving off to another. In fact, given the way that it's all connected, it may well be that whomever had done the original hack had sold these cards to a few different fraud rings. And they were all getting them. The moment they got them, they started attacking. Being able to link them all together in higher dimensions is a key part of it. And that's ignoring, there are more dimensions we want to add to there. Where are the devices located? Where are the merchants? Are these all similar merchants, similar amounts? What are the trends? That might actually help us separate out one fraud ring from another. So it's important for us to begin to look at the data with these higher dimensions and utilize things like the device, which is not available in authorizations. That's what's really great about 3D Secure. We get a wealth of data, truly rich, wonderful data we can use for fraud detection. So what's the bad? The bad is traditionally the customer experience. So when you look at it, 3D Secure can create a lot of friction. When something pops up on my window, I have to go get my phone, I have to type in a number. That keeps me from having a nice, quick checkout, an easy process. So that's a bad experience for the cardholder. They may end up abandoning that transaction, or they may switch to another card. Either way, for the merchant, if there's abandonment of that cart, they get no sale. That's a significant pain to the merchant. That's why sometimes you'll find regions of the world where you may have a very high enablement in the merchants for 3D Secure, but a very low number of transactions that are coming through 3D Secure. The merchants don't want to introduce that friction and the fear that there will be abandonment. So that's one of the things to look for. The merchant certainly doesn't want someone to go to another store, decide to go online to another merchant that's not 3D Secure so it can be fast and easy. For the issuer, losing that transaction has a few different impacts. We lose the interchange fee, right? Always nice. We lose future revenue for if this is a credit card, we can charge interest if people revolve their balances, etc. We may also lose front of wallet, and that can be a much longer term and a harder thing to really quantify. But that loss of front of wallet can have a significant brand impact. And then that can lead to a decreased market share. So what we really want to balance is customer acceptance, getting those transactions through without friction, versus fraud prevention and our operational costs. Again, when someone decides that they're not happy with the challenge or something, they may call in. You may have an inbound call that actually doesn't do anything to further your business, just to try to make an irate customer happy. We want to avoid that as much as possible. So the classic approach was to challenge almost everyone and then decline a few that were judged really risky. Those declines are from things like a list of bad IP addresses or or devices that have been fraudulent before. What many people are moving to is the risk-adjusted or risk-based authentication. Use rules, better yet use a model, in order to find out what really is not fraud. So many people are used to doing that on the authorization side. There's some nice information there. You can build a good model and choose allow or deny, right? Approve or decline. we can do the same thing here. We need to develop tools that have that strong ability to separate out the fraud from the non-fraud. Now, in the authorization world, we still have these three choices: to approve, to decline, and we can refer if we want to, right? No one ever does referrals anymore. It's hard for that person at the cash register to look the other person in the eye and say, here, you got to talk to someone, slows up the line at the till. It's really miserable. Here, if we do want to challenge, we can have good, effective challenges that don't take too long. And if we do them only when there's significant risk in a small portion of the transactions, we can really get rid of a lot of the problems of that abandonment. And then finally, some people are going all the way to pure silent authentication or decline, not doing that challenge anymore. That has some ease for our IT departments. We no longer need to find out what is their mobile phone number, send that SMS, have that SMS perhaps get lost, maybe the network isn't up or something like that. So it can actually be very nice to let people go through silently and then choose a portion to decline. You're probably already declining on the authorization side some portion of these card-not-present transactions. If you have better information here, make that decision here instead of in authorizations. So we need to use models to do this. I'm a proponent of models. My history is models, so that's kind of natural I would say that. But the reasons why, you saw the fraud changes rapidly geographically. It changes rapidly in many ways. So if you're writing a rule, you can do that, but you have to keep maintaining those rules. Those lists of risky merchants, those lists of risky countries need to be updated regularly. If you have a model that's tracking user behavior, that's looking at the differences in behavior, there are a number of vendors who can do this. I have a particular prejudice, but that's fine. That is something that can really help make this a robust system. So models need to use state-of-the-art techniques. You can't sit on your laurels and just wait, assume that you can always use the same technique all day long, every year, for the next decade. You've got to be looking at the behavior of the people, the behavior of the fraudsters, the behavior of the legitimate person. That's a way to get rid of false positives. In fact, you need to look at both that person's behavior and that device's behavior, because we got great information on that device. I have two laptops, one at home, one at work. My work laptop, I'm going to buy technical books on. My home laptop, I'm going to buy audio stuff for my hobby. And so I should have different profiles, different spending patterns on those too. And we should be looking at that to say, am I going out of my usual pattern on either of those devices? And the last thing is, rules are a yes-no. It's hard to turn rules into something where you can rank order and choose to impact the top 0.5%, the top 1%, the top 20%. With something that produces a good score, which is well calibrated, to give you that flexibility at the resolution where you need it, that's what models can do as well. So let's take a look at the impact on the issuer of this abandonment and failure, right? So let's just choose a number of about 15% of transactions on 3D Secure either abandon when they get challenged or fail that challenge. I chose it because it's a nice number to work with. Different issuers and also different regions have very different numbers associated with them. But for South Africa, I think that's just about right. So naturally, you would assume that if you stop challenging 100%, if you challenged only 50%, then we only have about 7.5% abandonment, right? If we can drop that down to 20%, we're better off still, right? We're at about 3% abandonment. So the trick is, how can we drop down that challenge rate without impacting our fraud? Let's first of all look at the cost of that abandonment. I promise this is the closest I'll come to an equation. So let's assume an interchange fee of about 1.2%, right? I know interchange fees can be up at around 1.7% and all of that. 1.2, again, is an easy number for me to look at up here in front of people and multiply by 15. So please excuse my just trying to make it straightforward. If you're losing 15% of the transactions, that means the interchange that you've lost is 15% of all of your interchange. What that equates to in terms of the total spend is about 18 basis points. Why am I converting it to the total spend? Because you don't get revenue from the total spend. People usually compare fraud rates to the total spend. So if I have a 1 basis point fraud rate, I'm going to have to, I have fraud on 1% of 1% of the transactions in my portfolio. And so by comparing it to basis points, we now can compare the amount of money that we've lost to what the fraud is. So if I assume that a fraud rate is 5 basis points, now, how many people in here have a fraud rate that is under 5 basis points in 3D Secure? How many people have no idea what their fraud rate in 3D Secure is? Okay. 5 basis points is actually fairly low internationally. You can actually see in the US where you can actually have up to 5% fraud rates, 100 times this. On the other hand, there are many countries where you have it in the 50 basis points, have it in the 10 basis points, and there are some that are down at 1 basis point. A lot of that depends upon what the merchants are doing. Are the merchants sending the risky ones, or are they sending the not risky ones? How many merchants have adopted it? Number of different factors in that, but let's assume 5 basis points for now. This line goes up to, at 100%, that 18 basis points. It can be very clear that if you're intervening in more than about 30% of the transactions, you're probably costing yourself more in interchange fees than you can possibly save in fraud. That's an important thing. The merchants know that as well. That's why they're willing to take some of that hit and put things through non-3D Secure. We as issuers need to know that and decide how are we going to make sure that the cost of our intervention is not more than our possible losses. And if you have fraud rates that are lower, naturally that line at 5 is going to be down at, say, 2. You have to go down to about 10% challenge in order to be effective there. So if I just randomly choose 20% of all of my transactions to go ahead and challenge, well, I'm going to then only be able to challenge about 20% of my fraud, so about 1 basis point. So this clearly isn't the way to go, because no matter what, the fraud that I stop is less than the losses, or the fraud that I allow through is less than what I've lost. So what you need to do is use very good rules or a very good model. Rules have a hard time keeping up with it, which is why I talk about models. But you want to be able to push that fraud, similar as what you would do with, say, Falcon. You want to push that fraud into a small portion of your transactions, the highest scoring ones. So now if I use a model and I choose it at 10%, my cost of interchange is quite low. It's at 1.8 basis points, and yet I can stop fraud at the level of about 4.5 basis points. Now I'm making money. Now I'm doing the right thing for the company as a whole. One of the difficulties is that this cost, the interchange fee, often is not accounted for in the fraud shop. It's accounted for somewhere else in the bank. The fraud losses are in that fraud shop. So as the person in charge of that fraud shop, I want to stop the fraud, and I don't care about my interchange. But for the whole bank, we need to think about it all together. And this is ignoring things like the interest. Certainly you're going to earn interest on those transactions that revolve as well. There's other revenue that we're not even looking at. This is just the immediate top-line impact. So with all of that, that's where I think we can turn the bad into good. We can start using models, we can do the right thing, challenge many fewer than 100%, stop the fraud, and let people through. In fact, that's a situation that many people are looking at all over the world. So 3D Secure 2.0 is coming along. First of all, for 3D Secure 1.0.2, as I spoke earlier, most payment card transactions used to be card present. That was a significant thing. Then in the 1990s, we had a rise in e-commerce. And so back in 2001 is when that first spec for 3D Secure came out, 1.0.0. Luckily, we're on 1.0.2, right? So it should have been updated along the time. Well, that one came out in 2002. So if you think of 2002, there were no smartphones. You were hip if you had a flip phone. That's a very different world than what we have today. Mobile devices have changed. The amount of e-commerce has changed. We're still using Rails built in 2002. That needs to change. And so EMVCo is designing this new spec. And it's very important to take a look at that and see what we can do. Now, there are technical advisors who are working with EMVCo. A number of them are issuers, a number are merchants. We have processors in there. We have all kinds of different people who have a stake in what happens here. So what's great is we're getting that holistic view, and we're getting trade-offs. As the issuer, we want to make sure that we stop any fraud that's coming through. We want more data, more data. As a merchant, I want more control. I want to know when you're going to intervene and be able to bypass that intervention if I decide to. So it's really a focus on getting that frictionless shopping experience and really encouraging this risk-based decisioning, pushing it toward using those models, using those sophisticated rule sets. A key thing is to make it amenable to mobile platforms. So when you're using Uber today, Uber doesn't have a browser behind it. They can't do 3D Secure if they wanted to. But if instead we put in rails that will work for apps, fantastic. That's a whole new pool of transactions which are now going to come into 3D Secure, where we can have more information about what's happening and make a better decision. There's a strong move from static to dynamic authentication. Well, that's because there are some legacy areas of the world that still have static. I believe everything here is dynamic authentication. Fantastic, right? Well ahead of many areas of the world. We want to make sure we can support the digital wallets, other forms of payments. And then there are some things that are country specific. Different countries have different regulations. If we can build in that to the rails, then we can take care of those things as they change. As some of the other speakers have said, it takes a long time to develop a new one of these and put in new rails. You want to think ahead of what might go wrong. What can you do? So EMVCo is doing that. We are part of the technical associates, and there's a strong non-disclosure agreement there. So there are many things that I can't talk about, but what I would point you to is there are a couple of press releases from EMVCo and then from MasterCard that have come out. Those are a great place to look, and we can talk about the implications of that information. So MasterCard wants to gradually replace 3D Secure 1.0 with 2.0. That means it's not a big bang approach. It means some merchants might choose 1.0, some merchants might charge 2.0. Because it's really going to be the merchant who chooses. They're the ones who initiate the transaction. So you as an issuer need to be ready for both of these, and as a merchant need to decide when do you want to adopt it. So the key thing is we have to be seamlessly interoperable with either version. So what are some of the benefits for the merchant that I believe are coming? Now again, this is now hypothetical speculation, because once EMVCo finishes its spec, which is still changing, then the associations have to decide what are the regulations around it, right? So this may be a year and a half off or something. We don't know all of those things that are going to happen. But one thing that I think is fairly confident, the merchant is going to have a bigger say in what happens. So let's say that instead of doing the evaluation for risk and then challenging right away, let's say we do an evaluation for risk and head back to the merchant. Tell the merchant we want to allow it, we want to deny it, or we're going to challenge it. Then that merchant may have a chance to say, well, I don't want you to challenge. This basket is more important to me. Let me take the liability and override your decision to challenge, and you can still have a smooth checkout. When merchants have that choice, even if they don't use it, if that's the kind of choice we give them, they're going to adopt this more and more. Now, as an issuer, in order to give up that control, there are a couple of things that I want back. First of all, some merchants are right now not sending any 3D Secure. This way, I get to see every transaction for my model, whether or not the merchant wants to allow me to challenge. So I've got more data. Also, I want to have more fields, right? There's lots of interesting things that those merchants know that I don't know. We do know they can do AVSs through the authorization to check out the billing address, right? But you can also check out the shipping address. Look at the difference between the shipping address and the billing address. Have blacklists of shipping addresses. But even then, you have to be careful, because the fraudsters are smart. They'll swap 2 letters in an address. The postal person will still get it there. So now you have to look at things like edit distances between your blacklists and the current one. There's lots of cool things we can start doing once we're getting that information. So that really excites me about this. As a data scientist, I want to gather and use all those new fields. I'm also expecting to see a lag between the start of using that protocol, everyone adopting it, and getting full tags on everything. So if I'm doing a supervised model, to use geek speak, that's going to take a little while. But I can begin to do unsupervised things right away, using these new things and augmenting whatever I currently have in rules and model. And then I also need to ensure that regardless of whether it's 1.0 or 2.0, my models know about all the previous transactions. So when I'm building a model for 2.0, it has to operate and talk to my model from 1.0. When I'm building a model for 1.0, it has to talk to 2.0. Same thing with rules. You want to make sure your rules for velocity, when you're looking at what is the spending velocity, you've got to consider both types of transactions. So there's some interesting complications coming, but it really is exciting. There are going to be very interesting things with those two coexisting. We're going to get great information coming in. We're going to see a change in the merchants, a change for our customers, and a change for the issuers. So in summary, we looked at some of the CMP fraud trends, really a global issue. We can learn about the fraud that's hitting other issuers, and that can inform what's happening to us. You can see the same device across issuers from around the world, and we do. We need to change how we're making our decisions. We should not just challenge everybody. That costs us money and the merchant money. We need to make sure that we're challenging only the high-risk ones and letting through the good ones and maybe stopping the very riskiest ones. And then finally, there are changes coming. And so those changes are going to be very good, and we need to be prepared for them and we're looking out for them. And thank you all very much.